She wasn't supposed to be alone in that corridor. Princess Charlotte had only stepped a few paces ahead, nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just a momentary gap between a child and the adults behind her. But in Buckingham Palace, even a moment can change everything. That's when Queen Camilla appeared, flustered, rushed, and without waiting for staff or protection. She reached for Charlotte. A gentle tug, a hurried whisper, a step toward a side alcove nobody had authorized. And standing just 10 feet away, Sergeant Alden Ware saw it all. He took one step forward, just one, and the entire corridor froze. Camilla stopped. Staff held their breath. And the quietest confrontation Buckingham Palace had seen in years began with a silence so heavy it echoed. Now, before we reveal exactly what happened, tell me where in the world you're watching from. And let's get into it. Just an hour earlier, the East Gallery corridor had been nothing more than a passageway, one of those long, high-ceilinged arteries of Buckingham Palace, where the daily rhythms of monarchy passed in quiet, orderly pulses. Staff moved through it in practiced patterns, carrying clipboards, garment bags, and discreet bouquets of fresh-cut flowers destined for reception rooms. It was late afternoon, the kind of hour when the palace softens. Sunlight filtered through tall sash windows, catching on gilt frames and polished flooring, turning everything warm and slightly golden. The hush in the air wasn't solemn or tense, just purposeful, like everyone was holding the same checklist in their mind. Today wasn't a formal event. No state visit, no ceremony requiring precision drills. It was something much simpler, almost domestic, the royal family gathering for an informal photo session before a charity event later in the evening. Staff were preparing a small VIP holding area around the corner, arranging screens, straightening side tables, adjusting flowers for the photographer who'd arrive within the hour. A nanny was meant to escort Princess Charlotte, while Prince William finished a brief meeting 2 doors down. Charlotte had wandered only a little ahead, no danger, no breach, just a child drifting toward the large portrait of Queen Victoria she loved to stare at. The air carried soft sounds, the shuffle of polished shoes, the whisper of radio earpieces, distant murmurs from the picture gallery, a page turning in someone's clipboard. Everything felt routine. Until it didn't. Sergeant Alden Ware stood near the Queen's Gallery junction, where 2 corridors met at a silent crossroad of duty. It wasn't a dramatic post. Nothing theatrical ever happened here. It was the kind of assignment given to guards who were trusted to watch without being seen, listen without reacting, and remain still even when palace life folded and unfolded around them. Alden stood exactly where he'd been placed. Feet aligned, rifle angled precisely, eyes fixed forward in that soft, unfocused way guards mastered. The look that saw everything without staring at anything. To a casual passerby, he was a statue in red wool and black bearskin. To the trained eye, he was a living checkpoint in a system that relied on discipline more than doors. He registered everything around him. The faint scuff of Charlotte's shoes on marble, the nanny's brief absence as she answered a staff summons, the hurried footsteps signalling someone important approaching, the shift in pace, fast, clipped, that didn't match William's steady gait, the sharp change in energy that always preceded Camilla's arrival when she was running late. Alden didn't move, didn't turn, didn't adjust an inch, but his instincts sharpened. This was the kind of corridor where nothing should ever feel rushed. And yet, something was rushing now. He caught a glimpse, just peripheral, of Charlotte standing alone, twisting the ribbon at her side. Not frightened, not upset, just waiting, small in the vastness of the palace. Then the pace behind him quickened. A breath of perfume, the whisper of an impatient exhale. Queen Camilla appeared, moving with purpose. And as her footsteps closed the distance between her and the child, Alden's posture did something subtle, almost imperceptible to most. It tightened. Not visibly, not dramatically. Just enough that every sense he possessed switched from observation to readiness. The palace was still beautiful, still golden, still orderly. But in Alden's world, the world behind the stillness, the atmosphere had shifted. Something was about to go wrong, and he already knew he might have to be the one to quietly correct it. Before the corridor fell into silence, before Camilla's hand closed around Charlotte's arm, Sergeant Alden Ware had already been watching the day unfold with the kind of attentive calm that only comes from years of standing still in places where stillness mattered. Alden was not the sort of guard tourists usually photographed. He wasn't the tallest, the most imposing, or the one with the sharpest jawline that children like to mimic with toy soldiers. He was the one whose discipline was so refined, so precise, that he seemed to dissolve into the background of any ceremonial space. The kind of guard people forgot was human until a moment required him to prove it. 12 years in the Coldstream Guards will do that to a man. So will the childhood he came from. Alden had grown up inside the shadow of service. His father, Thomas Ware, had stood at Windsor Castle long before Alden earned his own scarlet tunic, one of those quiet men who believed that duty wasn't measured in medals, but in ordinary, dependable presence. Alden used to watch him lace his boots with near-reverent care on cold winter mornings. "You don't stand guard because someone tells you to," his father once said. "You stand because someone needs you to." Alden had been 17 when he lost him. The palace never knew this. Most of his comrades didn't either, but every time Alden adjusted his bearskin before a shift, he felt the weight of that legacy in the roots of his spine. He learned early that stillness wasn't the absence of motion, it was a language, a statement, a promise. And he learned it from people who treated it as sacred. One of those people was Captain Rourke, his training officer, who once told him during a bitter February drill, "Some guards shout to be heard, the best don't need to." Alden took that to heart. His voice was quiet, his movements measured, his posture flawless, and his interventions, when they happened at all, were rare, intentional, and always rooted in protocol, never emotion. The first time he'd been assigned near Princess Charlotte was 3 years ago during a charity walkabout outside Windsor. She had been 5 then, dressed in a coat 2 sizes too big for her and fascinated by everything from the horses to the ceremonial sabres. At one point, she had looked up at him, this towering figure in red, and asked in a tiny voice, "Why do you stand like a mountain?" He remembered glancing down just slightly, only with his eyes, and replying softly, "So nothing can move you, ma'am." She had smiled, pleased with the answer, and pressed a paper sticker shaped like a star onto the edge of his glove before running back to her father. Alden kept the glove for weeks. He didn't feel protective of her the way a family member might. There was nothing sentimental or indulgent about it. But he respected the fact that she was a child, growing up inside walls built for adults, where decisions were made above her head and expectations placed on shoulders that were still small and unsure. Children in palaces were often seen but rarely considered. Alden never forgot to consider her. So when he noticed her standing alone in the East Gallery corridor, twisting her ribbon, blinking at the flurry of staff preparing for the photo session, something familiar tightened inside him. Not panic, not concern, just readiness. Her nanny would be back any moment. Prince William was only rooms away. Nothing was wrong. Yet. But Alden had learned long ago that wrong rarely arrives with announcement. It arrives quietly, quickly, in the spaces where the adults stop paying attention. And it was in those quiet spaces that Alden Ware knew his duty lived. For a moment, the East Gallery corridor held the kind of calm that only exists in the pauses between royal schedules. The photo staff had stepped into the adjacent room to check lighting. The nanny had been pulled aside by a steward confirming Charlotte's wardrobe notes. Prince William was finishing a brief conversation with an aide just beyond the picture gallery doors. It was no one's fault, just a natural drifting of grown-ups following duties they assumed others were covering. And in that brief gap, Charlotte found herself standing alone. Not dangerously alone, not abandoned, just momentarily unanchored in a place built for people much bigger than her. She stood near the edge of the window alcove, fiddling with the pale blue ribbon stitched onto her dress. Her shoes tapped lightly on the marble floor, not in impatience, but in that thoughtful, absent-minded way children tap when they're trying to stay calm. Her eyes drifted from the framed portraits to the fluttering hem of her skirt, then to the far end of the corridor where she expected her father to appear. Alden saw all of it, without moving a muscle. He watched the way Charlotte's shoulders lifted slightly every time footsteps echoed through the hall, hopeful at first, then settling again when she realized it wasn't William. He noted the way she pressed her lips together, trying to be brave in a space that suddenly felt too quiet. Nothing was wrong yet. But children have a way of sensing tension before adults do, and Alden had a way of sensing children sensing tension. Then everything shifted. Hurrying footsteps, fast, clipped, purposeful, approached from the Queen's retinue area. A sharp turn of fabric. A faint huff of impatience. The kind of entrance that made palace staff straighten instinctively. Queen Camilla appeared around the corner. Her schedule had run 15 minutes behind all afternoon. A rehearsal with event coordinators had gone longer than expected. Photographers were waiting. The corridor arrangement wasn't set to her liking. And now, seeing Charlotte unattended, her expression tightened, not with malice, but with frustration sharpened by fatigue. "Oh, there you are," Camilla exhaled, more to herself than to the child. Charlotte looked up, startled. "I was waiting for Papa." Camilla didn't let her finish. She reached for the girl's arm with a practiced familiarity, but a rushed grip, curling her fingers around Charlotte's forearm. "Come, darling," she said quickly. "Just a moment. We need to get you sorted before anyone sees you like this." Her tone wasn't cruel. Her intention wasn't harmful. But the execution, hurried, dismissive, brisk, made Charlotte's face stiffen. Camilla tugged gently but firmly, guiding her toward a partially concealed side alcove behind a floral screen set up for the photo team. It was meant as a staging nook, a place for last-minute adjustments. But it was also out of direct view, exactly where minors were not supposed to be led without a protection officer present. Charlotte stumbled a half step, caught off guard. Her hand tightened around the ribbon at her waist. "I want to wait for Papa," she whispered, barely audible. Camilla didn't hear it, or maybe she didn't register it. "Just for a moment," she insisted. "We don't want you photographed looking frazzled." Alden's instincts clicked into alignment with the precision of a lock turning. This was wrong, not dramatically wrong, and not dangerously wrong, but wrong in exactly the way protocol was designed to prevent. Charlotte's discomfort was subtle but unmistakable. Her feet dragging, her eyes darting toward the corridor where her father should have been, her voice too quiet to compete with Camilla's urgency. The designated protection officer was too far down the hall, caught behind a staff member asking a question. A private secretary hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. A footman paused mid-step, uncertain. Alden felt the change in the corridor like a temperature drop. The moment demanded someone to notice, and Alden noticed. He couldn't move yet. Protocol didn't allow instinct alone to justify a step. But the one thing every guard learns, from father, from instructor, from the weight of tradition, is this. Moments like these never correct themselves. They sharpen until someone steps into them, and Alden Ware was exactly the kind of man trained to step in quietly, only when it truly mattered. Camilla guided Charlotte toward the alcove with the kind of urgency that comes from a dozen things going wrong in a single afternoon. Her steps were brisk, but controlled, the same way she walked when her schedule was eating itself alive and she needed something, anything, to fall back into order. The alcove wasn't hidden exactly, just offset. A fold-back floral screen shielded a small staging space where stylists usually waited for last-minute touch-ups. It was a routine part of royal photography. It was supposed to feel harmless, but for protocol, harmless and hidden are not synonyms. Alden knew that. So did the protection officer farther down the hall. So did the equerry, standing near the junction, though his hesitation showed he wasn't sure how to respond. Camilla, preoccupied, didn't notice any of it. She only saw a young girl with wind-tossed hair and a slightly wrinkled skirt moments before an informal but important family photo. In her world, the optics mattered, especially today. Charlotte needed to look calm, polished, picture ready. "Just a moment, darling," Camilla murmured again, tugging the girl gently but decisively. "We'll smooth your dress and fix your hair, and then Papa will see you looking perfect." Charlotte dug her heels in just slightly, just enough for a trained eye to notice resistance, not enough for an outsider to hear it. "I want to wait for Papa," she whispered again. Camilla either didn't hear or didn't allow it to land. It'll only take a second. The problem wasn't cruelty. The problem wasn't intention. The problem was process. Protocol exists because the palace learned, generation by generation, that the smallest misstep could become the largest risk. Removing a minor, even for a moment, from clear sightlines without notifying protection. Breaking standard movement patterns for a royal child. Bypassing the officer responsible for her. Leading her into an area currently unmanned. Anyone trained for security felt the red flags immediately, and Alden was trained better than most. He saw Charlotte's expression tighten, not fear exactly, but discomfort, deeper than a child should carry alone. He watched her elbow twist in Camilla's grip, watched the small flinch she tried to hide. He saw her eyes dart once, quick, instinctive, toward him, as if she remembered the man who once said, "So, nothing can move you, ma'am." A private secretary nearby paused, unsure. He opened his mouth as if to interject, then thought better of speaking to a queen unprompted. A palace equerry took a half-step forward, then froze under the weight of royal hierarchy. Her Majesty held the authority. Everyone knew it. But authority does not override protocol concerning the protection of minors, not even in Buckingham Palace, especially not in corridors where staff were already watching, unsure why something felt off. And now, Alden could see the momentum building in the wrong direction, the kind that wouldn't stop unless someone placed a foot in its path. Camilla tightened her grip just enough that Charlotte's small shoulder rose in tension, her breath catching. Not pain, not danger, just pressure she couldn't challenge. "A moment, sweetheart, please," Camilla said, gently but firmly, attempting to draw her behind the screen. Charlotte swallowed hard and whispered, just once, barely sound, "Please, no." 2 words, small, fragile, easy to miss. But Alden heard them. He didn't move yet, but the decision was no longer a question. Behind the stillness of his posture, something shifted inside him, something old, learned, ingrained through years of service. A single truth the guard's code reminded them of constantly. When a child hesitates, a guard does not. Camilla continued guiding Charlotte toward the alcove. And that was the moment Alden Ware decided, quietly, irreversibly, that he would intervene. Alden moved before anyone realized the decision had already been made. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. It was not even particularly fast. It was a single step, one measured pace forward, heel to toe, perfectly aligned with the centuries-old discipline of the guard's drill book. The kind of step that would pass unnoticed on parade grounds, but felt thunderous inside the marble hush of a palace corridor. The shift of weight made a soft, clean click on the floor, barely audible, but it froze the air. Camilla stopped mid-motion, Charlotte's arm still in her hand. Her Majesty blinked, caught off guard, because royal guards are not supposed to move like that, not without command, not without cause, and certainly not in the presence of a queen. But Alden wasn't looking at Camilla. He wasn't looking at anyone. His eyes pointed forward, expression unchanged under the shadow of his bearskin, but his entire presence had changed shape. He no longer stood as a ceremonial fixture in red. He stood as a barrier, a line, a boundary, a living checkpoint of the Crown's own system. The corridor reacted instantly. A footman froze mid-step, tray wobbling slightly in his hands. A secretary holding a folder slowly lowered it, as if afraid rustling paper might break the tension. A protection officer at the far end of the hall shifted his stance, one hand brushing the radio at his belt, not reaching for it, but acknowledging the unspoken meaning behind that single step. Charlotte felt the change more deeply than anyone. She instinctively moved, without being told, without being encouraged, slipping behind Alden's knee like a child retreating behind a door. One small hand brushed the seam of his trousers, finding safety in the familiarity of his presence. Alden remained perfectly still. Camilla's eyes widened, her breath catching in offence rather than fear. "Alden!" she said, tone tightening into alarmed disbelief. "Sergeant, what are you doing?" No answer. Royal Guards do not break silence unless protocol requires it, but they also do not stand idle when protocol has already been broken around them. Camilla's fingers loosened on Charlotte's arm as confusion seeped into her posture. She wasn't a cruel woman, and she certainly didn't intend harm, but the optics of this moment were unmistakable. A guard stepping forward to stop her, staff watching, Charlotte hiding. Alden's stillness spoke louder than any accusation could. Camilla straightened, instinctively smoothing the front of her coat. A flush touched her cheeks, not of guilt, but of embarrassment. She was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone whose role was defined by obedience and immaculate posture. "Sergeant," she repeated, slower this time, "step aside." Nothing. The silence was almost too heavy for the hall to hold. Behind Camilla, a private secretary whispered, "Ma'am?" in a voice trembling with uncertainty. Charlotte's breathing was soft but tremulous, the kind a parent hears when a child is trying very hard not to cry. Alden didn't look at her, didn't look at Camilla, didn't shift an inch. But his message was unmistakable. You cannot take her out of sight. Not like this. Not right now. Not without the right people present. Not even if you are queen. Camilla tightened her jaw. "What exactly," she said, voice lowering into a strained whisper, "is the meaning of this?" Alden didn't respond, because he didn't have to. His stillness already had. For a long moment, the corridor held nothing but silence, tense, heavy, stretched thin enough that even the distant rhythm of staff footsteps elsewhere in the palace seemed to hesitate. Camilla drew herself up, shoulders tightening just enough to betray the sting of being stopped by a man whose job, outwardly, was to remain invisible unless summoned. "Alden!" she said again, each syllable firmer, sharper, like she was testing the air for weakness. "Step aside. That's an order." Alden's voice, when it came, was low and steady, so soft that it seemed to blend with the very stillness he stood in. "Your Majesty," he said, "the princess is to remain in full line of sight until her father arrives." Camilla blinked, taken aback not by the words themselves, but by the fact that he had spoken them at all. Guards speak rarely, and when they do, it is never lightly. "Are you," her jaw clenched, "refusing me?" Alden didn't shift, didn't bow, didn't posture. "I am following protocol, ma'am." Protocol. That word meant everything inside these walls. But to Camilla, in this moment, flushed with the pressure of schedules, photographers, and the image she was trying to preserve, it felt like a barrier she had not expected. Her cheeks warmed. Her eyes flicked down the corridor, registering the staff who were suddenly pretending not to observe. A footman was adjusting the same vase for the third time. A secretary stared very intently at a non-existent smudge on her folder. A young steward paused mid-walk, frozen between instinct and propriety. Camilla saw them all, and she hated that they were seeing her in this moment. She lowered her voice, trying to bring the situation back under her control. "Sergeant, this is not a security concern. I am taking her for a moment, nothing more." Alden's reply was immediate, precise, and unyielding. "Her safety precedes presentation, ma'am." Presentation. The word hit harder than he intended, though he hadn't meant it as a criticism, only a fact of palace operations. Camilla stiffened. "Alden, I'm not trying to endanger her." Her tone tightened, shading into defensive frustration. "I simply don't want her photographed like this." She gestured faintly at Charlotte's wrinkled dress, the slightly mussed hair, the ribbon twisted from nervous hands. But Alden did not shift, not even a millimetre. His silence was not disrespect, it was duty crystallized. Charlotte pressed further behind his leg, small fingers clutching the seam of his trousers as though it were a lifeline. Her eyes were wide, not in fear of her grandmother, but in the overwhelmed confusion of a child being led somewhere she didn't understand. Camilla saw that too. And for the first time, something in her expression flickered. Uncertainty, embarrassment. The faint realization that her urgency had translated differently to the child than she'd intended. She exhaled, a thin, slow breath. Her voice dropped into something closer to pleading than commanding. "I wasn't taking her anywhere improper," she murmured. "I just wanted her looking prepared. It wasn't meant to alarm her." Alden still didn't move. Protocol didn't bend with intentions. It only responded to actions. Someone farther down the corridor whispered, "Protection should have been here sooner." Another murmured, "They're never supposed to remove her alone." Quiet. But not quiet enough. Camilla swallowed hard, her gaze flicking between the murmuring staff, the steady guard, and the granddaughter whose posture had folded in on itself. "I don't appreciate being made a spectacle, Sergeant," she said, voice trembling with restrained indignation. Alden finally spoke again, soft, careful, unshakably respectful. "You are not, ma'am. I am simply preventing one." The words landed like a stone, dropping into still water, quiet, but carrying a weight that rippled through the corridor. Camilla stared at him, breath stilled. She couldn't command him. Not in this. Not when protocol trumped hierarchy. And in that quiet, uncomfortable moment, she realized he wasn't defying her. He was protecting someone. Protecting Charlotte, protecting the crown, protecting the dignity of a child who shouldn't have been pulled aside without her father or an officer present. Camilla's lips parted. Whether to argue or to retreat, even she didn't yet know. Because the sound that interrupted her put an end to the confrontation entirely. Footsteps, measured, purposeful, approaching. Prince William had arrived. Silence rarely lasts inside palace corridors. There is always a rustle, a footstep, a distant door closing. But the silence that followed Alden's last words felt unnatural, suspended, as if the corridor itself was holding its breath. No one moved. Every member of staff within view stood caught between the instinct to look away and the inability to ignore what they were witnessing. And each reaction, subtle, quiet, restrained, told its own story. The private secretary nearest the wall shifted his weight awkwardly, his gaze lowering to the papers in his hands. He pretended to straighten them, but his fingers fumbled slightly, an unmistakable sign of nerves. This was the kind of palace tension he was trained to avoid, not navigate. A young steward, barely in his first year of service, froze mid-step. His polished shoes scuffed the floor before he caught himself, nearly dropping the stack of carefully arranged name cards he was carrying. His eyes darted from Camilla to Alden to Charlotte, trying to understand the hierarchy of what he was seeing. The footman by the vase adjusted the same arrangement of lilies for the fourth time, his movements too deliberate, his shoulders held too tightly. He was trying to make himself invisible, a survival instinct among those who worked close to royalty. Down the corridor, the protection officer took a single step forward, not enough to intrude, not enough to claim authority, but enough to let Alden and Camilla know he'd seen the breach of protocol and recognized why the guard had moved. His eyes met Alden's for a split second. That silent exchange said everything. "You were right to step in. I should have been closer. I'll hold the perimeter now." But no words were spoken. Camilla's composure faltered further under the weight of so many watching eyes. She wasn't a tyrant, not cruel, not malicious, but she was a woman used to being listened to, used to staff falling into position, smoothing the way, reshaping the environment around her needs. Being stopped, firmly, silently, correctly, created a kind of embarrassment she hadn't anticipated. Her lips moved as if searching for an explanation that could restore dignity to the moment. "I wasn't taking her anywhere," she said at last, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I just didn't want her photographed upset or dishevelled." Her tone wasn't angry this time. It was defensive, tinged with something she rarely showed in public: vulnerability. Her gaze flicked toward Charlotte, who still stood half-hidden behind Alden's leg. The child's wide eyes caught hers for a moment, uncertain, wary, confused. Camilla's face tightened, the realization dawning. She hadn't frightened the child intentionally, but Charlotte was frightened by the rush, by the pull, by being moved somewhere she didn't want to go. And that fear, visible to every uniform and clipboard in the corridor, was enough to stop any further insistence cold. A palace equerry, older and experienced enough to sense the delicate line between assistance and overstepping, cleared his throat gently. "Ma'am, perhaps, if we wait for His Royal Highness—" Camilla cut him a sharp look. Not outright anger, just the warning flicker of someone who felt cornered. The equerry immediately bowed his head in apology and stepped back. Alden didn't react. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. His silence became a kind of anchor, steady, unshakable, holding the corridor in place, while the Queen herself wrestled with the optics and consequences of the moment. Charlotte's small fingers tightened their grip on Alden's uniform seam. She wasn't crying, she wasn't speaking, but the tremble running through her hand was enough for several staff members to exchange glances. This was why the guard had moved. A whisper from the secretary reached the footman. She shouldn't be taken anywhere without protection. The footman murmured back, "Not even by—" He didn't finish the sentence, because finishing it would have crossed a line no staff member dared cross. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, just as Camilla's breath caught in her chest, just as Alden's unmoving silhouette filled the corridor with the quiet authority of tradition, footsteps approached. Not hurried, not frantic, but steady, measured, familiar. The kind of footsteps that changed the energy of a room long before the person arrived. Prince William was coming, and every person in that corridor knew the moment had shifted. Again! The corridor, moments ago, a quiet storm of held breath and stiff shoulders, shifted again. Not because anyone moved, but because everyone felt him before they saw him. Prince William's footsteps carried the same cadence Alden had learned to recognize over years of service. Unhurried, steady, confident without being showy. Many people command a room by raising their voice. William was one of the few who commanded one simply by entering it. He rounded the far corner of the East Gallery corridor and took in the scene instantly, not with shock, not with alarm, but with the practiced clarity of a man who had dealt with a lifetime of delicate moments. Alden stood motionless at centre. Camilla stood tight-lipped, her hands still half raised, as if unsure whether to reach for Charlotte again or let her go. Staff hovered in cautious silence. And Charlotte, small, wide-eyed Charlotte, peeked out from behind Alden's leg. The smallest exhale left William's chest, soft, controlled, but unmistakably disappointed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand an explanation. He simply knelt, lowering himself to eye level with his daughter in one fluid, grounded motion that immediately eased her tension. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, voice warm, steady. "There you are." Charlotte stepped out from behind Alden, relief softening her features. She didn't run. She melted toward him, the way children do when they recognize the safest person in the room. William placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You all right?" She nodded, but her fingers curled into his suit jacket, holding on like she needed to anchor herself. Alden shifted his weight minutely, barely noticeable to an untrained observer, but William caught it. His eyes lifted, meeting Alden's with a subtle understanding. A silent exchange. "Thank you. Protocol upheld. You did exactly what I trust you to do." William offered the smallest nod. No ceremony, no display, just acknowledgement between two men who understood their roles. Then William stood, turning to Camilla. He didn't bristle. He didn't scold. He didn't humiliate. But his voice changed, still quiet, still respectful, but carrying a firmness only a future king could wield with such precision. "Is everything all right here?" Camilla straightened, smoothing her coat with a small flustered gesture that betrayed more discomfort than anger. Charlotte was alone for a moment, and I thought it best to move her aside. I didn't want her photographed upset or unprepared. William listened, really listened. His expression didn't shift, but the staff nearest him seemed to stand even straighter, sensing the weight of the moment. "I appreciate the concern," he said evenly, "but she stays in full sight of protection at all times. We've addressed this before." The correction landed gently, but unmistakably. Camilla's breath caught. She nodded, but the nod was tight, strained. "Yes, of course, I didn't mean to overstep. The photographers were arriving early and—" William shook his head once, slow, measured. "Her comfort comes first, presentation comes after." It wasn't a rebuke, it was a boundary, one delivered with the soft strength of a father, not a prince, who knew exactly what mattered most. Camilla stepped back, her heels clicking against the marble as she created space. Her embarrassment was subtle but palpable. In a palace defined by poise, even a small misstep left ripples. William turned again to Alden. "Sergeant Ware," he said quietly. Alden snapped into a sharper stillness. "Sir! You acted correctly." Just 4 words. But in the hierarchy of palace praise, they carried more weight than a medal. Alden responded with a barely perceptible dip of his chin. "Protocol protects the smallest, sir." William's gaze softened. A hand briefly touched Alden's shoulder, not a gesture of camaraderie, but of recognition. Then he guided Charlotte gently down the corridor, his hand resting protectively at the back of her head in a way only a father could manage. Camilla remained where she stood for several seconds longer, letting the moment settle, letting the eyes watching her fade into peripheral blur. Then, composed but shaken, she turned and walked away in the opposite direction, heels clicking fast, posture rigid. As William and Charlotte disappeared around the next corner, a hush lingered over the corridor, the kind that comes after a sudden storm. Only then did life in the palace begin to breathe again. And Alden, face expressionless, posture perfect, returned to his exact ceremonial position, as though he had never moved at all. The corridor slowly exhaled. Staff drifted back into their duties with the awkward, delicate choreography of people pretending they hadn't just witnessed something they knew would never be spoken of again. But Alden Ware did not move. His posture re-solidified into the flawless stillness of ceremonial discipline, spine aligned, chin level, hands resting against the white of his gloves. To an outsider, he looked unchanged, identical to the moment he'd begun his shift. Inside, however, the adrenaline was still cooling in controlled waves. Moments like that didn't happen often. Moments where instinct and protocol collided. Moments where a single step forward could alter the entire atmosphere of the palace. Alden had taken that step anyway, not out of defiance, not out of emotion, but because Charlotte had whispered, barely audible but unmistakably, "I want to wait for Papa." And that was enough. Alden remained still, his eyes forward, listening to the rhythm of the palace around him. Footsteps. Distant murmurs, soft echoes of Steph resuming their organized flow. Then William's footsteps again, and not hurried, not heavy, just confident, sure, familiar. Alden kept his eyes forward until William stopped directly beside him. "Sergeant Ware," William said quietly, voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had already processed everything. "Sir?" William didn't look at him immediately. Instead, he observed the corridor, the alcove Camilla had been steering Charlotte toward, the subtle marks on the marble where Alden had shifted, the faintly shaken expressions on the staff, still pretending to work. Finally, he turned to Alden. You did the right thing. Alden's posture didn't change. Protocol guides our actions, sir. William nodded once. Protocol and judgment. You demonstrated both. There was no flourish, no grand gratitude, just sincerity from a man who valued quiet courage far more than ceremony. For a brief moment, silence settled between them, mutually respectful, grounded, significant. Then William placed a hand on Alden's shoulder, a small gesture, a rare one. Thank you, William repeated, softer this time. Not just for today. Alden didn't respond. He wasn't trained for gratitude. He was trained for presence, for steadiness, for guarding the spaces where others forgot to look. William understood that. He didn't wait for a reply. He simply walked away, guiding Charlotte by the shoulders, speaking to her in that gentle, grounded tone only a father can summon. Charlotte glanced back once, just once. Her small hand lifted in a hesitant little wave. Alden didn't return it. He wouldn't break discipline. But his eyes lowered a fraction in acknowledgement, a gesture his mentors had taught him long ago, the smallest movement that carried the largest meaning. Charlotte smiled before William ushered her around the corner. And then they were gone. Camilla, too, had vanished, retreated into the warren of private hallways with clicking heels, and an expression staff would be whispering about for the rest of the day. A protection officer passed by, adjusting his sleeve, offering Alden a subtle nod. Another unspoken acknowledgement. Another quiet ripple of respect. But Alden's face remained composed, unreadable, as if carved from the ceremonial marble that lined the palace itself. The silence stretched, calm, settled. Alden inhaled slowly, then let the air slide out with the same measured control he brought to every aspect of his duty. The moment had passed. The corridor had returned to its usual rhythm, and Sergeant Alden Ware stood guard again, precise, unwavering, the invisible line that held tradition steady when human emotion threatened to shift it. The palace didn't erupt into chaos after the incident. Buckingham Palace never does. Its machinery is too old, too rehearsed, too anchored in centuries of protocol to let one tense moment ripple outward in obvious waves. But it did shift, quietly, subtly, the way a room changes after someone whispers a truth everyone had been avoiding. A junior footman passing by gave Alden a stiff, respectful nod before pretending to busy himself with adjusting a flower arrangement that had already been adjusted 3 times that hour. 2 personal secretaries, murmuring over a clipboard, kept darting glances toward Alden as they walked. One whispered, "He stepped in," and the other whispered back, "He was right too." They didn't linger. They knew better than to gossip in earshot. But the message carried in the air. A protection officer, the one assigned to William that day, paused near Alden under the pretense of checking his radio. His voice was low, meant only for Alden's ears. "Good move," he murmured. "Not many would have had the spine." He didn't wait for acknowledgement. They both knew Alden wouldn't respond. He simply walked off, but not without the faintest curve in his expression, a hint of respect. Down the corridor, 2 stewards exchanged a meaningful glance as they passed each other carrying silver trays. One muttered, "Saw her trying to take the girl," and the other replied under his breath, "Would have gone poorly if he hadn't stepped in." But none of this was dramatic. None of it was loud. It was the kind of quiet ripple that spreads among people who work in close proximity every day, who understand the delicate balance between protocol and personality. And in the middle of it all, Alden remained motionless, an anchor in a corridor that had just weathered a storm nobody would ever write down. After a few minutes, William and Charlotte re-emerged at the far end of the gallery, walking toward a private drawing room reserved for the informal family gathering. Their pace was relaxed now, Charlotte's earlier tension replaced by the natural lightness of a child returning to safety. As they turned the corner, Charlotte peeked back one more time. This time she didn't wave, she simply held his gaze, just long enough to say "thank you" without needing to speak. Alden's eyes lowered for a fraction of a second, a gesture so small and quick that most people would have missed it entirely. But Charlotte saw it. Her shoulders eased, and she slipped her hand back into her father's without turning around again. William glanced over his shoulder too, not at Alden, but at the space where the confrontation had played out minutes earlier. His jaw tightened slightly. Then he straightened the cuffs of his jacket, regained his calm composure, and guided Charlotte inside. Camilla, somewhere deeper in the palace, kept to herself. She wasn't furious, not exactly. More shaken. Not used to being contradicted so visibly. Not used to being reminded of rules that applied even to her, especially when a child was involved. Inside the palace, authority is not measured by volume. It's measured by who stands still when someone else moves the wrong way. Alden knew that. So did William. And now, so did everyone who had witnessed that brief, fragile moment. A senior equerry eventually passed Alden with a clipboard and paused for half a second, just long enough for his gaze to soften. "Well handled, Sergeant," he said. Not praise, just acknowledgement, which, in this palace, meant everything. Alden didn't answer. He simply continued standing, with the same disciplined stillness that had protected the smallest person in the corridor when it mattered most. And as the hour passed and the palace resumed its well-rehearsed rhythm, the moment began dissolving into memory. Not forgotten, just absorbed. Into the quiet, into the walls, into the unspoken rule everyone there now understood a little more clearly. Sometimes duty isn't about marching or guarding or ceremony. Sometimes it's about taking one step and reminding a palace why that step mattered. Before we wrap up, I want to hear from you. If you were in Sergeant Alden's place, would you have stepped forward too? Do you think he was right to follow protocol even when it meant blocking Camilla? And be honest, should a child's comfort always come before royal presentation? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our daily Royal Guard stories. And share this video with someone who loves these quiet moments of duty, tradition and real character. Stories that show what truly happens behind those palace walls. As our next videos appear on your screen, go watch another one. And I'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with a brand new story.